The following day saw our arrival at Craigmillar Castle, which lies approximately 3 miles from the centre of Edinburgh. Although missing many of its roofs and in parts semi-ruinous, Craigmillar is one of the most perfectly preserved late medieval castles in Scotland. It was the first time that I had investigated a castle, and I was unsure of what to expect. As I entered, I detected no spirit activity, but was aware of memories of great household activity. I was impressed by the name Preston. The names William, John, and Simon were also strong. We wandered around, going from room to room, and I detected no spiritual presence. Yet as we moved from place to place, I gained a picture of life as it would have been. I was aware that royalty was no stranger to these castle walls. For the first time, I felt the essence of a woman I was to become familiar with over the months of my investigations with predictions. Mary Queen of Scots. In the dungeons, I picked up on the agonies suffered by unfortunate souls who had spent time there. As I ran my fingers over the grooves gouged into the stone doorway, I felt the despair that they had experienced. We continued on until we reached the top of the castle. It was time to walk along the battlements. The wind had gathered in strength, and it was almost gale force as I stepped out onto the ancient stones. As I walked unsteadily along, I saw the spirit form of a lady approaching me, dressed in 1920s fashion. She wandered along the battlements, seemingly impervious to the wind against which I was battling. As she approached me, she pointed down towards the grounds where I could see a small graveyard. Patricia came the name. As she moved on, I turned round to watch her retreating back. As she reached a point of approximately 10 feet away from me, she disappeared just as suddenly as she had appeared. Craigmillar Castle is a fascinating place, and I enjoyed my visit enormously. My first visit to Tutbury Castle was also with a crew from Granada Breeze Television. As we arrived, I was taken back in time. Instead of a broad expanse of grassy lawn, I could see many people going about their daily business. There was the bustle of village life, with children playing, wives cooking meals, and the men conducting their trades, woodworkers, butchers, cobblers, and so on. Dogs slunk around in the background, looking out for scraps of food. Small carts creaked along the hard-packed earth roadways, and I could see a few cattle underneath the castle walls, grazing on sparse grass. Turning to look at the door of Tutbury Castle, I was amazed to see none other than Mary Queen of Scots, standing in the doorway leading to the Great Hall. I blinked rapidly a few times. This was no spirit form, but Leslie Smith, curator of the castle, in the flesh. Our investigation was to begin in the Great Hall. As I opened myself up to the vibrations of this imposing room, I became aware of a spirit form of a man building up. He had a regal bearing. "Describe the man to me, please, Derek," demanded Leslie. "He's very short," I told her, "with almost elfin features. He has long hair and a pointed beard. I definitely feel that he was a royal personage in his physical life." "What's he got on his feet?" asked Leslie. I looked down. "Shoes," I replied, "but they have a high heel on them." "You can only be describing Charles I, Leslie told me. "Is there anything else?" "Yes, he's walking over to the fireplace. He's putting his arm up and leaning against the fireplace. I get the definite impression that he's very proud of something to do with the fireplace." "You're right, Derek," Leslie said. "Charles I built that fireplace." I continued to wander around the room. Sitting in an enormous chair in the corner, I felt that this chair had been occupied by many people over hundreds of years, some of them royal, some not. There were so many vibrations. As I sat there, I began to sense the presence of a woman in spirit. I just knew that we were in the presence of the real Mary Queen of Scots. Although she did not show herself, I could feel her emanations around me as I sat on the chair. "I feel she's drawn here because of your portrayal of her tragic life," I told Leslie. "I'm sure that she's an inspiration to you when you give your speeches." I agree with you, Derek, said Leslie. I often feel that Mary's around me and almost talking through me when I speak. I rose from the chair and walked over to the staircase which descended directly from the great hall. There's something mysterious about this staircase, I said to Leslie. It was discovered no more than a couple of years ago, she told me. I looked down the stairwell. At the bottom I could see a male spirit form. He stood silently looking up at Leslie, who was standing at the top of the staircase with both her hands leaning on the balustrade. From nowhere, a gust of wind came rushing up the staircase. Leslie's headdress and heavy black velvet gown blew dramatically. There's a man down there who isn't particularly pleased by our presence here, I told her. I'm not being given his name at the moment, but he's not at all happy. We moved into a small antechamber next to Leslie's private office. There was a small fireplace on one wall, and in the corner was a wooden staircase to an upper floor. I was drawn to the corner opposite the doorway. I could feel a sudden drop in the temperature here. Put your hand out and feel how cold this area is, I invited Leslie and the crew. Each person put their hand into the area I had indicated and exclaimed at the difference in temperature. This is a cold spot, I told them, a vortex where spirit entities enter and leave our atmosphere. If you wish, you could think of it as being a spiritual doorway. I turned my attention to the staircase. I asked Leslie if it would be possible to go up to the rooms overhead. Of course, she said, but there are only a couple of storerooms up there. The doors are open, so go ahead. I climbed the stairs and turned the knob on the door to one of the storerooms. Nothing happened. I tried a few more times, but still the door remained firmly shut. Steve, the cameraman, tried to turn the knob, but he had no more luck than I did. I don't know. Men, rang out Leslie's voice from below. Let me come up and open it for you. I gave the doorknob one more try. Suddenly the door flew open. Steve fell back in shock, almost stumbling over. I looked into the room, and there in the corner stood the spirit man I last saw standing at the bottom of the staircase leading into the great hall. Get out of here, he demanded. This is no place for you. I command you leave this place. And who are you? I asked him. Who am I? You dare ask who I am? I am Edmund. He drew himself up to his full height and stood there with his imperious expression on his face. He seemed unwilling to continue speaking, but pointed towards the door. I could feel the strength of his anger building and knew that if I stayed in the room, it could cause problems for me and the crew. I descended the stairs. There's a very angry man up there, I told Leslie. He says that his name is Edmund. Ah, that's the Earl of Lancaster, she told me. He wasn't a very nice man at all. I could believe it. I was rather shaken by the venom he had displayed. He certainly resented my intrusion into what he considered to be his own property. Time was growing short, and it was soon time to leave Tutbury. As I turned to say goodbye to Leslie, I told her, Mary Queen of Scots will appear again. She will be seen here very soon on the ramparts. I hope so, Derek, said Leslie. It's been 7 years since she was last seen at Tutbury. It wasn't a happy place for her. I'd given up hope of her ever being seen here again. A few weeks later, Leslie came to the Granada Breeze Studios in Manchester. You were right, Derek, she told me. Mary did appear on the battlements at Tutbury, and she was seen by a number of people.
End of Disc 1. Disc 2. Coronation Street.
As I was leaving the Granada Breeze Studios in Manchester one evening, I heard someone calling my name as I was passing the security lodge for the Coronation Street studios. I turned to see the head of security for that area waving to me. I've a bit of a problem, he said. Some of the Coronation Street cast and backroom staff have encountered things that they just can't explain in the corridors close to the dressing rooms. My boss has asked whether you could do an investigation to find out what's going on. because whatever it is, it certainly isn't of this world. I agreed to return the following Sunday when the area would be much quieter. On the appointed day, the head of security took me into the building and led me to the corridors where problems had been experienced. Cold spots had been noticed, light switches had been interfered with, and door handles had been rattled. When the occupants of the dressing rooms had opened the door to investigate, there would be nobody there. I quickly became aware that there was indeed a spiritual activity in the corridors. My first encounter was with a spirit whom I immediately recognised as Doris Speed. This lady had long played the character of Annie Walker, the landlady of the Rovers' Return. Doris still considered that the street and its people were her concern, and she was dismayed at the manner in which the bosses of the programme were treating her fellow actors and colleagues over an issue involving contracts. She was very upset that certain actors might be forced to leave Coronation Street and was determined to get her point across. "They must listen," she said. "This must not happen. Do they want to lose Coronation Street altogether?" Doris was still berating the powers that be when another very famous Coronation Street character, who is now in the spirit world, made her presence known. It was Annie Walker's arch-enemy, Elsie Tanner. The lovely, warm-hearted spirit of Pat Phoenix had decided that she too would like to voice her concern that certain actors had been singled out for particularly heavy treatment. Although she spent some time joking with me about making people jump when she rattled the doorknobs, she was equally angry about the situation and wanted me to let everybody know that the old cast was still looking out for their fellow actors, even if it was from another realm. It was obvious that the two ladies were of the same mind, unlike the characters of the years gone by. They were united in their wish that all the cast of Coronation Street should rally together, fight for their rights, and stifle the problems which were prevailing at that time. I moved a little further on and was taken completely by surprise when a spirit man made himself known to me. I could not see him, but I knew I was communicating with Peter Adams, who had played the character of Len Fairclough. He still seemed to be a character of strong opinions. As I turned the corner of the corridor, I made my final link with two lovely ladies. Pat Phoenix was one of them, and this time she was joined by the Grand Dame of Coronation Street, Ina Sharples. I felt privileged to be sharing the atmosphere with the spirit of the great Violet Carson. Both women told me that for weeks they had been trying to draw attention to themselves by visiting the set and constantly turning lights on and off. As I turned to leave the corridor, one of the dressing room doors opened, and there stood a good friend of mine, Bill Tarmy, who plays the character of Jack Duckworth. "Derek, what are you doing here?" he asked. I told him that I'd been asked to look around because of certain things which had happened. "Yes," he said, "there have been quite a few funny goings-on just recently." I was very pleased to hear some weeks later that the problems had been sorted out, that all was peaceful and harmonious once more on Coronation Street.
The Birth of Most Haunted.
It was a Sunday in March 2000, and I was scheduled to go to Manchester to film Predictions with Derek Acorah. The presenter, Yvette Fielding, a great fan of the programme, was in the audience, and later that day we were introduced. She told me that she was fascinated by my work and by the paranormal in general. A few weeks later, she stood in for Becky Want, the regular Predictions presenter. It was on this occasion that she had a question for me. She and her husband, Carl Beattie, had come up with an idea for a programme and asked me whether I would be willing to take part. Their idea was that they would take a group of people, a medium, parapsychologist, camera and sound crew, around the country to alleged haunted locations to conduct investigations and attempt to catch paranormal activity on film. It was an interesting concept. I would be doing exactly the same as I was for the Predictions investigations, but other people's experiences would also be filmed, with the parapsychologist providing the voice of reason. I agreed I would take part. The following Friday, Gwen and I joined Yvette and Carl in Pizza Express to discuss the matter further. This was the first time I had met Carl, and although I felt he was a deeply spiritual man, I also felt that he was rather sceptical of spirit communication and mediumship. I knew the only way to provide proof was to give him a couple of messages from the world of spirit. I opened myself up to Carl's vibrations and was immediately aware of a man who was standing beside him. "You have a man with you," I said, "a grandfather who tells me that his name is Frederick. He likes to be known as Frederick and wouldn't thank anyone for calling him Fred." Carl looked at me blankly. I gave a little bit more information, but I could tell that it really wasn't making much of an impression. Oh dear. Carl could not place the communicating spirit at all. Nevertheless, he was very polite and told me that he would think about all the things I had to tell him. We continued our conversation about the forthcoming pilot program and agreed on a date for the filming. On the appointed day, Yvette arrived at our home early in the morning. "We've a long drive ahead," she told me. "We're off to Sussex." 6 weary hours later, we arrived at the location and Carl walked up to me with his hand outstretched. "Derek, good to see you. Oh, and by the way, that chap Frederick, who you told me about last time we met? I didn't recognise the name at all at the time, but when I next saw my mother, I asked her whether there was anybody in our family named Frederick. She told me it was my grandfather. She also told me that he always insisted on being called Frederick and hated to have his name shortened to Fred. So you were right on everything you said, Derek. Now tell me, how do you see this program going? Do you think it'll be a success?" I told him that of course he and Yvette would sell the program, but it would not be without some initial difficulties. However, ultimately I saw the program becoming a huge success. Since then, Most Haunted has become the most watched paranormal program on satellite television and has beaten all records. Long may its success continue.